One of the very fundamental principles in Torah is, of course, the phenomenon of prophecy. Rambam writes as follows: "It is fundamental to our faith that God communicates by prophecy with man. Without prophecy, the Torah is basically a closed book. Without prophecy, God is unavailable." Now we know that there was an age of prophecy when prophets roamed the world, and that age came to a close. Prophecy was removed from the world and was replaced with judges, with sages. But Rambam here, who lived only 800 years ago, makes the statement in the present tense. Our belief, a fundamental principle of our belief, is not that God once communicated by prophecy, but that God communicates by prophecy. Present tense. Let's find out what that means. Prophecy is bestowed only on a very wise sage, of strong character, who is never overcome by his natural inclinations in any regard. That eliminates just about everybody. Instead, with his mind, he overcomes his natural inclinations at all times. He must also possess a broad and correct perspective. A person who's full of these qualities and is physically sound can become a prophet. When he enters the Pardes, when he goes into the study of the inner parts of Torah and is drawn into these great and sublime concepts, if he possesses a correct perspective to comprehend and grasp them, then he will become holy. He will advance and separate himself from the masses who live in the darkness of the time. He must continue and diligently train himself not to have any thoughts whatsoever about frivolous things, the vanities, and the intrigues of the times. Instead, his mind should constantly be directed upward towards the throne of glory, God, to comprehend the holy and pure forms, and gazing at the wisdom of the Holy One, blessed be He in its entirety, from the most elevated spiritual form until the lowest condition of earth, appreciating His greatness in all of them, God's greatness. After these preparations, the spirit of prophecy will immediately rest upon him. In other words, there isn't anything you do to become a prophet. What you have to do is become a perfect human being. And when you become a perfect human being, then immediately, meaning without further effort or preparation, prophecy will come. So, a person does not strive for prophecy. He strives to be the best he can be. And if he succeeds, then prophecy will come to him. Let's understand some of these qualities. He has to be of strong character. The Gemara says that God will cause His presence to rest only upon someone who is strong, rich, wise, and humble. Rambam doesn't mention humble, and he doesn't mention rich. Yet the Gemara does. The reason he doesn't mention rich is because you don't have to be rich to become a prophet. You have to be rich to succeed as a prophet. Because if you're not rich, no one's going to listen to you. So rich means admired. There are times when people will admire a leader because of his wealth and therefore listen to him. There are times that wealth, material wealth, is not impressive to the masses, and they will admire him for some other reason. But he has to be rich, meaning he has to be gifted beyond the masses so that they look up to him, and when he receives a prophecy and delivers it, they will listen to him. But if he's an unknown, if he's poor, if he suffers, who's going to listen to him? They'll think he's talking from his misery. So Rambam doesn't mention it because Rambam is not saying how a prophet succeeds in delivering the message. He's saying how the prophet becomes a prophet to receive the prophecy. Now, he doesn't mention humility, because earlier Rambam already mentioned that every human being must be humble, and exceedingly humble. So this is not unique to the prophet, and therefore Rambam doesn't feel a need to repeat it. We assume that if he is wise and he is strong, he's certainly humble. Because without the humility, he would never get to be wise, and certainly not strong. What do we mean by strong? Obviously, strong means strong of character, not physically strong. Although the Gemara says that Moshe, being the first prophet, had all of these qualities. Torah testifies that he was the most humble. He was also extremely strong physically. He was physically very imposing. In fact, he was the only one who was capable of putting the felt or material draperies over the Mishkan that served as the roof of the Mishkan. So the Mishkan was basically these tall wooden beams covered from floor to floor with these purple wool woven curtains and drapes. And only Moshe could do it, because only he was strong enough and tall enough. And he was also wealthy, financially wealthy, because the first tablets of the Ten Commandments, which he broke, were made out of sapphire. And he got to keep all the pieces. But Rambam is not talking about physical strength, although that too is necessary for people to respond, but not in order to receive the prophecy. What is necessary for receiving prophecy is strong in character. And strong in character means all the good qualities that a person is supposed to have, personality traits. He has them all in strong measure. Kindness, compassion, tolerance, and so on and so forth. So he has to be wise, and he has to be strong in character, and he has to be rich, which according to at least one opinion, rich means, as the Mishnah says, who is considered rich? The person who's content with what he has. If he's not content with his physical circumstances, then he is distracted and he will not achieve prophecy. So he has to be completely indifferent to worldly affairs. He's not bothered by his poverty or by his circumstances and so on. Rambam writes concerning humility that you have to be, and we mentioned this I think last week, you have to be extremely humble, not moderately humble. Certainly a prophet who has to rise above the average person would certainly have to be extremely humble, which means have no personal agenda at all. Rambam mentions in another place that he actually wrote a book, a complete book, on the subject of prophecy. But no such book has ever been found. So either it never got published, or it just probably sitting someplace in a vault in the Vatican. They have all the original manuscripts. What is very significant, if we want to bring a little Hasidus into Rambam's teachings, you would think that the one quality that a prophet does not have to have is wisdom. Because prophecy means that God sends a message to the people through you. It is not your message. It's not what you understand. It's not what you know. It's way beyond anything you could possibly have known. Only God could tell you this, and that's why it's a prophecy. Well, then why do you have to be smart? You might even say that smart would interfere, and that a good prophet is probably better off being a little slow. That way, he doesn't have his own opinions to impose on God's message, and God's message stands alone, it stands clean, it's the pure thing. So you might think that the dumber, the better. In fact, the Gemara makes this statement that since the close of prophecy and the destruction of the temple, prophecy is now given to the insane. Of course, now you never know when it's a prophecy, when it's their insanity. So it doesn't do much good. But if you remember, If you remember that story in the papers about the speaking carp, the talking carp, the fish. See, now that, that makes sense. When a carp tells you something, you know it's coming from God. And it's not like, well, is that your personal opinion, or is it... So why would wisdom, why would being smart, and as Rambam says later on, smart in all subjects, with a broad knowledge, why would that be useful to a prophet? How would that not interfere? How would he possibly keep his wisdom to himself? Keep his opinion out of it? Well, we see from this that, again, you don't become a prophet by being smart. You become a prophet by being high. How do you get to be higher than the average person? How do you perfect yourself? You start with wisdom. That is the Chabad philosophy. You cannot achieve perfect character unless you work through the mind, through intelligence. Which means that even if you want to be a prophet, you can't be a fool. If you want to reach the unknowable, you first have to know everything there is that is knowable. You can't skip. You can't go from ignorance to the unknowable. And so the first quality is to become a prophet has to be wise. Not that that will make him a prophet. That will enable him to perfect his character. And when his character is perfect, prophecy will come to him spontaneously or immediately. Now, what happens when prophecy is given? When the Spirit rests on him, his soul becomes intermingled with the angels called Ishim. There are 10 levels of angels. Some of them are called Chayes, Chayes HaKadosh, the holy animals. Some of them are called Ishim, man, like Ish. As it says, and a man wrestled with him, and it's referring to the angel. So the angel Ishim is the level that the soul of the prophet reaches, and he will be transformed into a different person and will understand with a knowledge different from what it was previously. In other words, the knowledge that he uses to understand the prophecy is not the same knowledge or wisdom that he used to become a mensch. It's of a different quality. He rises above the level of other wise men. As it says in Samuel, the Spirit of God will descend upon you, and you shall prophesy with them, and you will be transformed into a different person. What does it mean, a different person? A different mind. So the prophetic mind is not the mind of the prophet. That make sense? The mind of the prophet is perfected by his efforts and by his diligence and by his study and by years of training. But then when the prophecy actually occurs, he's using a different mind. An interesting story. The older Hasidim, who had been Hasidim of the Alter Rebbe, of the first Rebbe, were still alive when the third Rebbe became Rebbe, which is the grandson of the Alter Rebbe. They appointed him Rebbe, and they said to him, deliver a discourse, which only a Rebbe can do. And he did. After he delivered the discourse, the Hasidim sat down to study it. And there was a debate among the Hasidim as to what the discourse meant. One of the older Hasidim interpreted it a certain way. Another interpreted it differently. So they went to the Rebbe, to the Tzemach Tzedek, and they asked him, what does it mean? And he said what it meant, and it was not the same as this older Chassid's interpretation. So they came back to the older Chassid and they said, the Rebbe said that it means something different. He said, that's his opinion. And they said, what are you talking about? He was the one who gave the discourse, and so the Chassid said, when he gives the discourse, It's Torah coming from heaven. Now he's offering his opinion. I also have an opinion. In other words, when he was giving the discourse, he was living or functioning on the prophetic mind. After that, he goes back to his mind. Well, I'm older than him, I also have an opinion. So there's a difference between the mind that receives the teaching or the prophecy and then the mind that interprets it. Now, not all prophets are the same. There are levels of prophecy, just as there are levels of wisdom. One sage is greater than another sage. The same is true in prophecy. One prophet can be greater than another. What they all have in common, of course, is that they speak truth. They receive prophetic visions only in a visionary experience or during the day after sleep overtakes them. In other words, they fall asleep unnaturally so that they can receive the prophecy without blowing their fuses. Because if they receive it while awake, their circuitry can be damaged permanently. Kind of similar to when God wanted to create Eve, he put Adam to sleep. Why? Some say because he wanted to surprise him. The reason was because that process would have been too intense and too overwhelming to experience while awake. And so a kind of a sleep, I'm not even sure whether you should really call it sleep at all, but some kind of a unconsciousness puts your conscious mind to sleep so that your prophetic mind can now function. The Torah actually says, I make myself known to him in a vision, I speak to him in a dream. So what are these two things? Vision means while awake, and dream means when unconscious. When any of them receive the prophecy, their limbs tremble, and their physical powers become weak. They lose control of their senses, and so they can't comprehend what they see. And a great dark dread fell over him when Avraham was receiving the prophecy. And also with Daniel, it says, my appearance was horribly changed, and I retained no strength. In other words, for most prophets, the body can't handle the experience. And so they have convulsions, literally, which is one of the reasons that they need to be strong. Those who say that they need to be physically strong is not so that they can receive the prophecy, but so that they can survive the prophecy. Let's go ahead to how we recognize a prophet. Prophets cannot give a prophecy whenever they desire. Instead, they must concentrate their attention on spiritual subjects. They seclude themselves from worldly activity and wait or anticipate in a happy, joyous mood, because prophecy will not come to a person who is sad. That's why I think we're told that while Yaakov was mourning the loss of Yosef, for those 22 years, he received no prophecy. When he was reunited with Yosef, all of a sudden prophecy came back. And that's why the prophet's disciples would help them along by playing an instrument, a harp, a flute, when they were seeking prophecy. As of course we know the story with Shaul, that David would play the harp and then he would receive prophecy. All the statements above describe the path of prophecy for all the early and later prophets, but not Moshe. Moshe was different, completely different caliber. Moshe received prophecy whenever he wanted. And that's why he was able to say, when they asked him something and he didn't know what the answer was, he says, wait here, I'll go get the answer, I'll come back. He could have prophecy whenever he asked for it. Secondly, his body was not overwhelmed. And so he remained standing and did not go into convulsions. And when he spoke with his own voice. Most prophets, it's not their voice. Physically, different voice. Moshe spoke with his own voice. All the other prophets received their prophecy through an angel, through an intermediary. Moshe spoke to God face to face. All the other prophets were overawed, terrified, confounded by the experience, but Moshe was not this way. God spoke to him as a man speaks to a friend. Another distinction is, what happens to a prophet after the prophecy is completed? He goes through this awesome experience, and then it's finished. The message is complete. What happens? He goes back to his old self. He returns to his non-prophetic mind. Not so with Moshe. Once he received the Torah at Sinai, he never went back to his natural mind. He was constantly in the state of prophecy. Now, how do we recognize a prophet? There are those prophets who are private citizens. God speaks to them for their sake. It's just a one-on-one relationship. And that's not what we mean generally when we say a prophet, because when we say prophet, we mean a messenger to the people. But there are prophets who receive prophecy, and it's nobody's business. God is speaking only to them, to the prophet, not something they have to convey to the people. But then there are those who are chosen by God to deliver the message to the people. Well, these need a little help, because how are the people going to know? How will the people trust? And so on. So even Moshe, God speaks to him, and Moshe keeps saying, yeah, but who's going to believe me? Why should they listen to me? How will they know that you spoke to me? So to help with that, God gives the prophet certain abilities, supernatural abilities, to perform very impressive deeds so that the people will know that you got to listen to this guy. He is, in fact, a prophet. So when God sends a prophet on a mission, he is given a sign or a wonder, a miracle, to perform so that the people will know that God sent him. But not everyone who performs a miracle should be accepted as a prophet. So a prophet should perform a miracle, but a miracle does not a prophet make. Only a person who's known to be suitable for prophecy and then comes along and performs a miracle, then we take him seriously. But if he was not suited, if we know that he's just an ordinary guy and he comes along and performs a miracle, well, that's neat, but that doesn't make him a prophet. So if he is known to be wiser and stronger and better than all of the other people of his society, of his community, if he follows the path of prophecy in holiness, staying away and above worldly issues and matters, and then performs a sign, then the Torah says, he is my prophet, listen to him, obey him. It's possible for a person to perform a miracle even though he's not a prophet. And there's a value to that. There's a value to miracles. We're not talking about charlatans or about black magic. We're talking about holy people who can perform miracles. Rambam says there's a value to that. It shows people that God really does run the world and that there's more to the world than meets the eye, and that's very valuable. But that doesn't make him a prophet. Nevertheless, even though he's not a prophet, it is still a mitzvah to listen to him. Because he is wise and fit for prophecy, then we should follow him and learn from him, even though we don't call him a prophet. This is very important because what is the authority of all those Jewish leaders who came after the age of prophecy? On what authority do they speak, and why are we obligated to listen to them? So Rambam is saying here, it's not only a prophet that you listen to. It's anyone who has the wisdom and the character who could, in the days of the prophets, could have been a prophet, even though there's no prophecy, you listen to him and obey him as well. So this is the nature of the commandment. We're commanded, for example, to rule, to pass judgment, and pass sentence, and execute a person based on the testimony of two witnesses. Now, why do two witnesses have that much authority when it's very possible that they didn't see correctly, or they misunderstood, or they're lying. Certainly 2 witnesses are not infallible. And yet Torah says, if 2 witnesses come along and after cross-examination and due process and so on and so forth, if their testimony stands up, then you assume the man guilty and you kill him. How can you be so sure that these 2 witnesses are telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yet the Torah says that's the way we rule. The same is true with a prophet. Even though he is not technically a prophet, but if he has the qualities of a prophet, and the wisdom of the prophet, and the character of the prophet, and he shows you a sign and a wonder, then you listen to him as if he were infallible. Now, here's a very interesting statement. Why do we trust 2 witnesses? Torah says, man judges by what he sees, but God judges by the heart. They use this quote, the commentaries use this quote, to support, Rambam himself uses the quote to support this statement. He says like this, considering these matters, the Torah states, hidden matters are for God, but what is revealed is for us and our children. In other words, we cannot know what goes on in the heart of this sage. We can't know if he's perfect in all ways and if he's telling us the absolute truth. Just like we can't know whether 2 witnesses are telling us the absolute truth. But that's because it's the human condition. What more do you want? You can't know any more than what you see and what you hear. So check it out to the best of your ability, cross-examine the witnesses, check them out, and if what you see and hear sounds okay, well then you got to go with it. Is it really the absolute 100% truth? Only God can know that. So don't even aspire to that. So Rambam seems to be saying, man sees what is revealed to the eyes, God sees into the heart. And therefore, we can't measure the prophet's heart, we can only measure what we see. He looks good, trust him. That's what Rambam seems to be saying. But let's take a look at that quote itself and see if Rambam isn't telling us something much deeper. The verse says, Ki ha'adam yira le'einayim, man sees with his eyes, v'Hashem yira le'levav, but God sees into the heart. What is the Torah telling us? Is the Torah telling us that we can't see what's in the heart of another person? We don't need Torah to tell us that. We know our own limits. Is the Torah trying to tell us that God can see into the heart? We don't need Torah to tell us that either. So this sentence, this statement, what's the point? For man sees with his eyes, God sees into the heart. What is the point? When the Torah says, if 2 witnesses testify that a certain person committed murder, and you've cross-examined and you've done everything you need to do, and the testimony holds up, then you execute the murderer based on the testimony of 2 people. Is the Torah saying, you may be killing the wrong guy, but what the heck, it's the best you can do? God forbid. The Torah is saying, you've got to trust 2 witnesses because you can only see what your eyes tell you. Only God can see the heart. Well, the good news is that in the days of the Sanhedrin, if a person was found guilty of murder, he had to be executed. What if the person says, yes, I committed the murder, but I repent. I'm doing tshuva. I regret. Is he not executed? So the Gemara says, no, I'm sorry, but the judge can't measure your tshuva. He has to go by what his eyes see. Tshuva is in the heart. The judge can't judge what is in your heart, and so he has to execute you. God, however, when God judges, he can look into the heart. So if God is judging a murderer, God can see whether he has done a sincere tshuva. And if he has, then he is forgiven. He is no longer punishable by death. So today, when there is no Sanhedrin, we're safer. We're better off in a way, because now only God is judging us, and God knows what's in the heart. But here's the problem. Are we then saying that in the days of the Sanhedrin, when they executed a murderer based on the testimony of two witnesses, not taking into consideration the tshuva that this man did, had God been judging, he would have been found innocent. He would have been forgiven. But because the Sanhedrin is judging, they found him guilty and they execute him, which means they executed someone God doesn't find guilty. Is this possible? God himself is telling us to do something that is not consistent with what he thinks? God is saying, I can see into the heart. As far as I'm concerned, this man gets to go free. But you don't know that, so kill him. That can't be. Because which one is true? Certainly God's opinion. It's very possible that this sentence, man sees what is revealed to the eyes, but God sees into the heart, is not a study of contrasts. It's not saying, look at the difference between man and God. Man can only see what his eyes tell him, but God can see into the heart. That's a nonsensical statement on the face of it. Putting them together in the same sentence is not for the purpose of contrast. What the pasuk is saying is that when man judges by what his eyes see, God is judging into the heart, making sure that the same judgment is arrived at. While you are judging by your eyes, God is judging by the heart. And so he makes sure that you arrive at his conclusion. So why do we trust two witnesses completely, to the point where we're willing to execute a person on their testimony? Because if they are legitimate judges, if they are Sanhedrin, and God gives them the authority to do that, then while they are judging by their eyes, God is checking out the heart to make sure that the judges arrive at the correct conclusion. So, has it ever happened that the Sanhedrin punished a person, not even execute, punished, any punishment, any decision that the Sanhedrin ever reached? Is it possible that had they known a little more, they would have reached a different conclusion? The answer is no. God does not permit that. And that's why today, when we don't have that caliber of judge, we can't judge at all. Not even with 10 witnesses. 100 witnesses. Doesn't matter. So here's what Rambam is saying. And again, this is an example of how Hasidus enriches, doesn't change what Rambam says, but enriches it, making us suspect that Rambam really meant that. If a man comes along and he has the qualities of a prophet, and he tells you that this is how you ought to behave, can you trust him 100%? Torah says, trust him. But is he really telling you the truth? Or is it just like, you got to trust somebody, so, take a risk. Trust him because it's a mitzvah for you to trust him, but is he perfect? No. Can he be mistaken? Yeah. But I'm going to trust him anyway because God asked me to. No. So Rambam wants to give you an example of other laws in Torah that have the same principle. So he says, it's like two witnesses. Now, when God tells you to trust two witnesses, is it like take a chance? We're talking about life and death. You actually execute a person based on their testimony. It can't be that they might be wrong. Torah says that wherever there's a doubt, any kind of doubt, you cannot kill. You can't even whip a person. You can't even give him the 39 lashes if there's a doubt. On the contrary, where there's even a slight doubt about a person's life or death, you violate every other mitzvah to save that life. Even though it's only a doubt. He might be seriously ill. This might be dangerous. Well, then drive on Shabbos, eat on Yom Kippur, whatever it takes to keep him alive. So if there was a doubt about the testimony of the witnesses, you wouldn't be able to kill someone on their testimony. The High Court of the Sanhedrin had 71 judges. If a person was brought to court and all the judges agreed that he's guilty, you have to redo the trial because something's not right. That they all agree that he's guilty puts a little doubt. That itself creates a little doubt. What, 71 Jews agreeing? No, can't be. Something's wrong. So here's what Rambam is saying. There are circumstances in Torah other than prophecy where God has to back up a human being's decision, making the human being infallible. What is that other circumstance? The two witnesses. The judge. I'm sorry, not the witnesses, the judge. When the judge comes to a conclusion, to a verdict, based on the testimony of two witnesses, the judge has to be infallible. Otherwise, he's killing an innocent man, and that can't happen. So here's what Rambam is saying. You wonder how a person can be infallible? How can any judge be infallible? And they have to be. They're killing people. They're executing people. They have to be infallible. The answer is this verse in Torah. Man sees what is revealed to the eyes is talking about judges, or anybody who judges, even informally. When the judge sees what his eyes are telling him, God is behind it because God sees into the heart. Otherwise, this verse doesn't really say anything at all.